everybody. I'm Donna Harris. I'm CEO of Builders and Backers. I'm so glad that you could join us today for the first event of our 2024 webinar series. Today's session will be about an hour long. I'm going to start with some opening thoughts. I'm going to share some of our research and observations from working with thousands of entrepreneurs across the world. And then we're going to have a conversation with our panelists. We'll hear their perspectives from their own personal experiences and the stories they've collected along the way with their work, and learn more about their organization's work in support of entrepreneurship and democracy. And then we're going to also bring you into the conversation. We're going to leave time for our panel to answer your questions, and feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your panel to ask any questions that you'd love for the panel to talk about. So before we jump in, a few points of order that I just want to highlight. First is we host hundreds of virtual events, and we always ask our participants to act respectfully toward our speakers and to each other. So we hope that you've come to this conversation with an open mind and ready to listen and maybe be challenged and learn a little. Second is all the organizations that are represented here are nonpartisan. So we're not going to discuss or advocate for any party, any candidate, any issue. Everyone here is participating to advance the work of fostering entrepreneurship. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So at Builders and Backers, if you're not familiar with us, we are ardent believers that entrepreneurship is a phenomenal tool for fostering democracy. So much so that we believe that everyone with the passion to pursue an idea is worth investing in. Through our programs and our full stack of funds, we're on a mission to get as many ideas as possible off the sidelines into action and growing, so that they can create jobs, they can create wealth, they can create thriving within their communities and our world. So given that, and given that U.S. political campaign season is now in high gear, we felt that it was appropriate for this conversation to be the first webinar of our 2024 series. So obviously, unless you are living under a rock, you cannot miss that it's election year in the US. Campaign ads are everywhere, on the TV, on radio, internet, social media, in your mailbox, your text message, your phone, your email. 2024 is shaping up to be one of the most hotly contested cycles in recent memory, and one of the most expensive in history. Over $16 billion will be spent on campaign ads in 2024. That's billion with a B. Now, for context, that would make it the 10th largest ad market in the world, surpassing all ad spending in Australia. In fact, if you come from the world of entrepreneurship and investing as I do, it also surpasses the total amount of angel and VC seed stage investing in the United States in 2022, which is when VC and angel investing were at all-time highs. So lots and lots of money and attention being focused on politics. And it's not surprising that this much money is going to be spent in this campaign year, because if you're paying attention, you also know how divided we've become. And in fact, most of us are not satisfied with the way democracy is working today. Now, Gallup actually asked Americans about their satisfaction with US democracy 9 times since 1984. The first time they asked Americans how satisfied they were, 61% of us said we were satisfied. 40 years later, just 28% of us are satisfied with the way our democracy is working in this country. Now, that record low dissatisfaction is consistent across the board, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent. It seems to be the one thing that is unifying us. Now, this is not just a US phenomenon. Pew Research Center polled people across 27 countries, and across the board, just 45% of people surveyed globally are satisfied with how democracy is working. So, there's lots of reasons, of course, why this is, from frustration with politicians and economic dissatisfaction, anxiety about social change, concerns about individual rights, and more. But interestingly, Pew found a very strong link between economic discontent and democratic dissatisfaction. Those who say the current economy is bad were actually more dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. And our views about economic opportunity also play a role. Those who believe that their country is one where people cannot improve their standard of living are more likely to be dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. Now, this is I found very intriguing as an entrepreneur and as somebody who focuses on creating economic opportunity. But it's also intriguing if we think about what the word democracy actually means, right? It comes from the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. Democracy literally means power of the people. And so in this moment, we posit that we actually have far more power than most of us think we do. And let me explain. So, as an entrepreneur, entrepreneurs don't necessarily narrowly define our power solely through the lens of politics. When I look around, I see problems everywhere that we could be solving. These are opportunities to build things, to build solutions. And when we layer in how much technology has advanced in the last decade, we literally have the opportunity to rethink and even reimagine every aspect of how our world works. And this gives us really an unparalleled opportunity to question everything and come up with new ideas and build entirely new things. And at the same time, capital to build things has never been more abundant. Even taking out the last few years of down dollars in the venture capital world, the amount of capital available to fuel new ventures has actually grown tenfold, 10x in the last decade. And at the same time, communities have spent billions building ecosystems and infrastructure to support startups, incubators, accelerators, mentorship programs, and more. There are people and organizations ready to help aspiring entrepreneurs in every corner of the nation and increasingly around the world. So this should be a renaissance moment, right, for building things, a modern sort of entrepreneurial gold rush. This should be a moment when we're feeling hopeful and optimistic, and especially as you consider our legacy as a nation. And I think if you've read Mark Andreessen's essay about building, he says it well. Our nation and our civilization were built on production, on building. Generation after generation, our country has embraced the ideal of innovation. Rather than waiting around in the wings for solutions, Americans bring their ideas from roads and trains to factories to smartphones and more. And through building, our country has become an economic powerhouse and in many ways a beacon of freedom and democracy and opportunity. So in this moment, when we should be seeing unprecedented levels of optimism and droves of entrepreneurial activity, we're instead seeing a divided society riddled with conflict, primarily focused on the lens of elections and politics. So this dichotomy first became clear to me in 2016, and it didn't make sense to me. And so I set out to figure it out. And I thought, I'd spend a few months sort of exploring this. And what actually happened was a 3-year research project. And over the course of 3 years, I dug deeply into understanding this disconnect and also experimenting with solutions. So, I won't bore you with the details, but thousands of books and articles and white papers and meeting and talking with and sitting with hundreds of people from across the country from all walks of life and countless experiments so that we didn't just navel gaze at the problem, but actually develop some theories on what we could do about this and test them to see what actually works. So we're going to be sharing the findings of this research in webinars and white papers and articles throughout 2024. So be sure to follow along on LinkedIn and Instagram. But today I want to focus on one aspect of this research journey, which is really around the sort of bullseye for the democracy conversation. So, I mentioned earlier, I see opportunities everywhere as an entrepreneur, and I think it's a fantastic moment to be building new things. But I wondered, did other people believe that too? Did people see problems that they could solve? And did they recognize the opportunities around them to build? And it turns out, yes, that they do. In fact, every single person that I met on this journey, without exception, was able to articulate a problem they cared about, something they wanted to solve. Interestingly, though, a pattern emerged. Many of them used a very particular phrasing when answering the question. They would say, somebody should do something about fill in the blank. Now, as an entrepreneur, this piqued my interest. Entrepreneurs are, I don't know, we're people of action. We're forgiveness people rather than permission people, right? We see a problem, we get an idea, we jump headlong into trying it. We don't locate the source of solving outside of ourselves. So I wondered, why weren't more people embracing this mindset? If they saw the problems and the opportunities, did they not have ideas that they could put to work? So again, more research, more digging, and it turns out we do have ideas. In fact, 60% of us have an idea for something that might hold the potential to become a new business or a venture. And even more of us in the younger generations. But only 92% of people, only 8% were actually doing anything. 92% of us not actually taking action on those ideas that we have. And this is a massive missed opportunity. Nation of 258 million adults. That's 142 million missing new businesses. Globally, that's over 3 billion potential companies that we could be potentially starting. Think about the jobs not created, or the generational wealth not being built, or the economic opportunity that our communities are missing out on. Now, imagine what kind of game-changing innovations are just sitting on the sidelines or stuck in people's heads. So I dug into why, like, what was preventing people from actually doing something with those ideas. And there are some very clear roadblocks on the on-ramp to entrepreneurship. And we're going to do a deep dive into this in our March webinar if you're interested in getting details on that. But for most people that I spoke with, they gave a very almost elemental and even emotional answer: fear, lack of confidence, lack of certainty about whether they should take action or how to take action, doubts about their own ability to be able to do it, feeling overwhelmed, even almost a sense of looking for permission to build things. And underpinning that is really this dual challenge of agency and capacity, right? Agency, the belief that we have the power to act. It's not up to somebody. I'm the somebody. But agency is insufficient without capacity. We need more than just the belief that we can act. We need the skills and tools to do so. So, across the board, when I talked with successful entrepreneurs, they had very high degree of agency, right? Either instinctively or because they've been trained through high caliber programs. They have this sort of core set of entrepreneurial mindsets and skills and tools that have really enabled them to take action on their ideas. And interestingly, largely that made them more hopeful. So the idea that having a belief the future can be better and the belief that they have the power to make it so. So that made me wonder, could we foster a greater sense of agency and capacity to build in more of us? Could we all be builders? And could we equip people to be builders? And in doing so, could that actually be the thing that gets more of us engaged in our communities and generating a sense of optimism and hope? So, over the past 3 years, through our Idea Accelerator and other programs across the US, we have proven this hypothesis to be unequivocally true. We've equipped nearly 1,000 new builders from big cities and rural countrysides. We've worked with everyone from high school dropouts to PhDs. Not only have they successfully launched hundreds of new companies, from high tech stuff to Main Street shops and social impact and community projects and more, our graduates report significantly higher degrees of agency, as well as feeling equipped to solve the problems and bring ideas to life. So, you know, it was interesting that it also turns out that this act of building together is actually bringing people together, young and old, blue and red, every age, race, demographic imaginable, across industries with ideas of all shapes and sizes. Our builders are working alongside one another. They're encouraging one another. They're supporting one another and helping one another succeed. They're building and they're backing. So pretty quickly, it starts to feel a whole lot bigger than just getting more people to start businesses, right? Entrepreneurs drive change. And the very mindset and tools that we train entrepreneurs to use to launch new companies are, in fact, core to increasing our agency, to feeling like we have the power to make our communities and our country a better place. and to bring us together across what divides us. These are things critical to fortifying democracy. Now imagine what our country could look like, even our world, if we all saw ourselves as builders, if we all had a sense of agency, if the entrepreneurial tools to solve problems and bring our ideas to life were largely shared and adopted and embraced. We can solve the problems we care about. We can bring our ideas to life. And doing so can foster resiliency and increase our sense of optimism. We also can bring power and ownership back to people who feel powerless. And doing so can dramatically change the culture of a community and even a nation. So I will pause here, and with that, I'd like to bring up our panelists who will join me and provide their additional insights, and we'll go deeper into all of this. So first, let me welcome Victor Hwang. He's the CEO of Right to Start. And Victor, I'd love for you to take a couple minutes and introduce yourself and your organization, and especially highlight anything that you'd like as it relates to entrepreneurship and democracy before we dig into the questions.
Thanks, Donna. I thank you so much for organizing this. You and your team are amazing, and so it's just a real pleasure to work with you and to be here. My name is Victor Hwang. I come from a line of entrepreneurs. My family actually started an entrepreneurial business just to be able to afford to put me through college. So they lived the American dream, and I saw the power of entrepreneurship in transforming our lives, my family's lives, and also the lives of the people that worked for them and with them. And I also saw how it transformed the entire community. This was in Austin, Texas, and how entrepreneurship actually has a huge power in lifting people's prosperity and driving economic well-being for so many people. Um, but I also saw the difficulty of building a business. My parents struggled in the early years, just, how do you file forms? How do you even get going? Who do you talk to? Even the vocabulary of business was so foreign to them. So I've seen the struggles that entrepreneurs go through. And so I've spent almost all my career now in this tackling this question of how do we actually break down barriers so everyone gets this chance to do so. So I've been an entrepreneur. I've invested in companies. I've shut down companies. I've exited companies, some successfully. And then I've got pulled into this question of economic growth and how do you actually build it at the level of communities and states and even countries. And so I've been doing this work for a long time now. And a number of years ago, I got pulled into the Kauffman Foundation, where they asked me to run their entrepreneurship division. And so I ran that for a number of years. And as part of that work, we did work all across the country, working with thousands of organizations and hundreds of thousands of people in lifting up entrepreneurial opportunity. But one of the huge things that I saw was missing was this issue of where is the voice of the entrepreneur in our democracy today? And so at the Kauffman Foundation, we launched the first ever policy agenda around entrepreneurship, which surprisingly was the first time anyone had ever done that, to actually pull together a comprehensive roadmap for how we actually lift up entrepreneurship at the local, state, and federal level. And that became America's new business plan. But there's still this gap, which was, well, what is the voice? Where's the infrastructure to actually do that work? And so that led to the work I'm doing now. So about 3.5 years ago, we launched Right to Start. And Right to Start is an organization, it's a campaign, nonpartisan, nonprofit, fighting to lift the voices of entrepreneurs in public life. And we believe that everyone has a fundamental right to be able to build their entrepreneurial dreams, and that our role is to break down, to engage civic dialogue, to drive civic change, and to break those barriers down. And we believe entrepreneurship is a basic right, just like you have a right to speech and you have a right to worship. You have a right to start. That is, it's as fundamental to the founding of America and also to human nature, to the very thing that makes us human beings, is that entrepreneurial urge, that we all have that ability to do so. And within Right to Start now, in 3.5 years now, we have a presence in 28 states. We have had, just in the last few years, we've had 15 state legislatures introduce over 40 Right to Start Act bills based on our ideas. Our bill has been shared out as shared state legislation across the country through the Council of State Governments. It's been validated in lots of places. It's passed in Nevada and being implemented into law right now. It's also being emulated in New Mexico, where the executive branch is implementing an Office of Entrepreneurship on their own. And so we advise states and cities and even the federal government on how to build entrepreneurship and opportunity. And we'll talk lots more about this, but really the idea is that the voice of the entrepreneur needs to be in the civic system. Entrepreneurs are the ones with the least time and the least money to get involved and to have their voice. And if we don't have an organized way to get that voice into the system, then the system doesn't respond, and it gets tougher and tougher to be entrepreneurial, which is exactly what we found. And happy to share more of that data and research, but I'm just really glad to be here, Donna, and to have this really important conversation in an election year.
Wonderful. Glad you could join us. Thanks, Victor. So next I want to bring up Hilary Crow. She's Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Hilary, you're working squarely in the intersection of business and civics and all things related to democracy. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the Chamber's focus on business and entrepreneurs as a critical force in fortifying democracy.
Thanks so much, Donna. It's a pleasure to be here. To introduce myself, I'm Hilary Crow. I'm Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. A little bit on the foundation, our mission is really about harnessing the power of business to create solutions for the good of America and the world. So this conversation fits squarely within that and our mission. At the foundation, I lead our Civic Trust, which is an initiative we launched a few years ago, really focused on how we can mobilize the business community around elevating civics as a national priority and acting to help improve the state of civic knowledge and understanding across our country. We see that currently 70% of Americans can't pass a basic civics test. And we are really concerned about what that means for the strength of our long-term democracy, as well as our economic competitiveness. And so excited to dive into this topic and talk about how entrepreneurs in particular can help strengthen our democracy for the long term.
That's great. Okay, so let's dig in. I did a lot of talking already, so I'm going to turn the tables to the two of you. So let's start sort of at a high level, right? The sort of premise that entrepreneurship is the key tool for fortifying democracy. We don't often think about democracy this way. We don't talk about democracy this way a lot. So I'd love your high level thoughts on this and or reactions to anything that you heard in the opening remarks before we start going deeper. So I'll open the floor to whomever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think there is nothing more human than the desire to make a better world, right? If you compare us to all the other creatures on Earth, we are the ones that can actually think of a better world that doesn't exist yet, and pull together all the resources and people and things required to make it happen. And we can reimagine that over and over again. In fact, that's what really has set us apart. That's how we've conquered the Earth. And so there's nothing in that way. There's really nothing more entrepreneurial than nothing more human than the ability to be entrepreneurial. And so when you talk about, Donnie talked about agency plus capacity equals hope. I mean, that is kind of the definition of what it means to be human in many ways, which is the ability to make and build and improve things for yourselves, your families, your communities, and those around you and those you care about. And so, we've got a system now that actually we've forgotten that, right? I kind of think of, in many ways, if you ever seen the movie WALL-E, I'll give away the middle of the movie if you haven't seen it. We're at the point when they finally arrive into the ship in outer space and all the people are there sipping Slurpees and watching movies, and they've forgotten how to plant, how to make things. And I think in many ways we've gotten a society that is actually very comfortable in consuming. I've heard people call it the couch economy, where you can get everything ever from your couch. You can order everything, every movie ever made, every book ever written. You can order any food to be delivered. You can have pretty much any good that's produced in the world can be shipped to you in your couch. And that's very tempting, right? It's very easy to do that and to forget that actually that's not what got us here. And I think what happens is over time, we lose a bit of that spirit. And there was an art project a number of years ago, and I've looked for it and I can't find it again, where they compared the eyes of animals in the zoo versus in the wild. And they looked at the eyes of an elephant in the wild and in the zoo, and a tiger in the wild and in the zoo, and they put them side by side, and you could see the difference in the eyes of the animals of who was in the wild and who was in the zoo. And I think, and the ones in the wild, of course, their eyes are just on fire, right? And the ones that are in the zoo, their eyes look like they're zombies, like they're just kind of, basically crawling through life, and I think there's something about that. The entrepreneurial fire, it runs deep in the human soul, and so we need to do something about that. So we did a voter poll at Right to Start, a national voter poll. First time there was a voter poll about how people think about entrepreneurship across the voting public. And 94% of Americans say this is important to the future of the country, that everyone's got a fair opportunity to start and build their own business. Our pollsters were shocked. They said almost nothing comes out like that, where it's so unifying for people. It is so fundamental. People see it as so deep in what the country should do, and to empower that ability in people. And so I think it's just very deep, and we can't forget it. We can't lose sight of it.
Oh, I love that. Hilary, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, entrepreneurship really shares core values with democracy, right? When we think about things like open competition, participation in public life, individual responsibility, serving others, finding solutions. And so entrepreneurship can really have a positive role in strengthening American democracy, because it really enhances our economic and political freedoms. It fosters that innovation and potential for social change, and helps create a more diverse and competitive private sector, right? As he was just saying, entrepreneurs drive change. They provide ideas, initiative, and leadership that really invigorate development and can truly transform society, both through productivity and creating jobs that help shape public sentiment and trust in institutions and things like that. And then, of course, at the individual level, that entrepreneurial mindset and personal initiative and business leadership really form such a strong foundation that's part of civic leadership as well. And so that entrepreneurial mindset includes things like critical thinking, problem solving, independent action, resourcefulness, accountability, that are so important. And, unfortunately, we are lacking in a big way right now. And so we need more entrepreneurial leaders, whether that's through startups as well as other types of enterprises, to really help solve our big challenges of today, because they do so without depending on government action, and by their superpowers, really, instead of seeing a challenge or a problem, they see an opportunity, and an opportunity to innovate and to solve. And when you combine that entrepreneurial spirit and attitude with a sense of civic values and ownership, that can really strengthen civil society in a big way.
Yeah, it's funny when you're talking. I remember back to like after 9/11, there were billboards everywhere that said, see something, say something. But it's sort of like, see something, build something is
Right.
what our billboards should be saying now, right? And not just individual entrepreneurs in the private sector, but intrapreneurs and inside enterprises. And you've described some of the work that you're doing at the foundation in terms of recognizing the challenge that civics education is lacking, and we need to put a priority on that. And instead of taking the traditional route of hand wringing and saying, why doesn't the government do something about that? You guys actually created a program. We'd love for you to take a minute and share what that program is.
Sure. So under the Civic Trust, we have 3 pillars. One is focused on civic literacy. The next is civics at work. And then the third is really elevating civics as a national priority. And so our biggest and most significant project to date has been under our civics literacy pillar, called the National Civics Bee. And it's really focused on how to engage young people, as well as other generations, like their parents, their families, their community leaders, business leaders, educators, elected officials in their communities, all around a national competition that's focused on civics. And so we started with a pilot in a handful of places just 2 years ago, and have now expanded that to 28 states and about 120 communities across those states. And we're already seeing the impact of young people and their families and their communities, because it really starts with knowledge, right? Understanding, oh, this is how the government is supposed to work, and this is how I can engage at the local level, and this is how I can be part of, improving my community and the place where I live, and, the ripple effect that can have. And so, we strongly believe that whether somebody wants to grow up to be a plumber or the president or an entrepreneur, that they really need to understand how our government works and what their rights and responsibilities are as citizens. And so we're really excited about the National Civics Bee and the potential that it has as we continue to scale this across the country over the next 2 years.
Yeah, that's awesome. And such a great example of like, let's not wait for someone else to build something. We're the someone. Let's go do that. Victor, I'd love if you've got some stories from your travels. I know you, like I, are out and about around the country and visiting states and communities across the nation. I'd love if there's stories that you might want to share with us about this sort of exemplifying entrepreneurship as a democratic process and ideal and a tool for strengthening our democracy.
So many. I mean, on one hand, you have a system where a lot of people feel like the system is tilted against them. When I was at the Kauffman Foundation, we did a survey and found that entrepreneurs generally feel like the system is disfavoring them. So 81% of entrepreneurs say the government favors big businesses over them. And then 69% of entrepreneurs say government doesn't care about them at all. And so the question is, well, how do you change that? And how do you get involved with it? And at Right to Start, we've been recruiting people to be involved in this. And so we've got a network of 29 ambassadors across the country that are working at the grassroots. And the work, for instance, we did in Nevada was in part led by the work of our ambassadors, Doug Irwin and Heather Brown, on the ground as citizens that care about this issue. And they helped bring this issue to light. They helped spark a lot of the conversations that eventually led to legislation getting passed, the Right to Start Act, which has created this Office of Entrepreneurship in Nevada. And something as simple as one of the elements of the bills that have been passed in Nevada in the past year were around expanding capital access. And something as simple as walking across the street and talking to a legislator in a bar, this was Heather Brown, that has the power to change the conversation. And so this is, that's what we've seen in our ambassadors. We've seen this work at the grassroots in places like in Arkansas, where we've got entrepreneurs that gathered together to organize a petition to give it to the mayor. This was a case where it's a town where you've had entrepreneurs that have had some challenges in getting through permits and licenses and getting their businesses started, just to cut through some red tape. And so they organized a petition and they started hosting meetups, and they've actually elevated this issue now within the communities and the cities of Arkansas, where there's actually things happening right now to try to break a lot of those barriers down. And so people can take action. And a lot of it is, we found it's not like cities and states and policymakers don't care. It's that no one speaks up. Entrepreneurs just don't have, when you're busy hustling, if you've ever built your own business, you just don't have time to get involved in speaking up. You're busy trying to get that permit. You're not busy trying to change the permitting process. And so what is missing is an organized voice around that. And so we found that you've got to be out there getting people with that capacity, giving them the agency to build agency in a way. People don't even know they have a voice. And starting around the middle of the last century, we kind of shifted from being a democracy to being more of a special interest driven democracy, where you had to have organized voices. You had to have, and if you look at the larger organizations, they have economies of scale. They can hire lobbyists and advocates to speak up for them when they need it. And that's fine. That's part of the democratic process, but there isn't a counterbalance to that. The entrepreneurial voices aren't often heard. And so that's one of the things we've seen is when you start speaking up, people love it and they get very excited. And we find that policymakers from the cities to the states to the counties to the federal level, they actually really they care. They want to do something about it. They just don't know what to do. And so we've seen that from the local level to the state level to the national level across the country.
Yeah, one of the dynamics that I saw pretty intensely at Start America, we were mobilizing individuals like us, serial entrepreneurs, people that have built businesses, people that are building businesses. I built my first few businesses in Detroit, and the number of times that I wanted to be at the table in Detroit having a conversation about the contribution that I could be making to make Detroit a great place. And this was, before it was cool to be an entrepreneur from Detroit, which it is now. And, sort of found that everybody is waiting for someone else to take the lead, right? The governors, the mayors, the city council, the officials in the city very much believe in supporting entrepreneurship, but they're waiting to be given direction on like, what exactly do we need? And when you go to the individual entrepreneurs, they don't see themselves necessarily as having permission to be the ones that can actually build the ecosystem. So we literally had this moment where we had champions from all over the world in a room at a summit, and we literally addressed this like, you officially have been given permission. We are giving you permission today to go do this. And it was like a light bulb just turned on for them, that they were sort of waiting for someone else to do this. But in the sort of cycle of how do you break the cycle of inertia, they're the ones that actually hold more of the power. But they've got to engage, you got to speak up, you've got to articulate what you need. And so like the premise behind this entire webinar is like, if we believe that entrepreneurs are one of the most important constituents and groups and types of people that we can have in a democracy, we need to make that plain. Everybody needs to know that. Everyone needs to agree on that. And we need to do whatever we can to get as many people as possible to learn these things, embrace these skills, and we need to clear as many roadblocks as possible, including the ones that are up here, keeping us from actually going and doing things that we sort of think we might need someone's permission to do.
I've got a quick story to share around that. So Mr. Kaufman's birth town is called Garden City, Missouri. And so Mr. Kaufman, of course, probably the best known entrepreneur philanthropist. He launched the Kaufman Foundation 30 years ago. And in Garden City, we actually took a bus tour. We took the entire Kaufman entrepreneurship team down to Garden City, and we met the mayor and leaders of the town. And they had 4 restaurants in town, and they had a Dollar General store, but they had no fresh produce. And this is the city called Garden City, remember? And so they had no fresh produce because it was essentially big agriculture that dominates the produce in the town. And so they talked about, well, what does it take to get fresh produce? And they said, well, we've talked to all the big supermarket chain stores to see if they'll open, and they don't want to open it because it's a small town. It's like 1,000 people. And they go around town, and everyone says to the mayor, well, somebody should do something about that, right? And this is what you were saying earlier, Donna. The mayor would say, well, somebody should do something about it. The people in the town would say somebody should do something about it. And the thing is, like, no one asked the question of, well, maybe we should start our own fresh produce market. And that's just kind of like a question that just struck me, like, well, how come no one even asked that question of why don't we just start our own? This is not rocket science to start your own fresh produce market. And it doesn't have to be every day. It doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be that big. Just create your own fresh produce market. And there are towns that have done that. A little town of Ord, Nebraska, something like 400 people, created its own fresh produce market out in western rural Nebraska because they had no other access to fresh produce. And so it's doable, but
it's doable, and it's so, but the way we're going to get into a lot of this in our next webinar, but the way that we on-ramp people into the world of entrepreneurship is very heavily skewed towards VC backable stuff. And we aren't necessarily creating the connective tissue so that if I'm in Fargo and I make the connection that I could open a grocery store, who in my national or global network has already done that? So we can shorten the learning curve, because I shouldn't have to figure all this stuff out from scratch. Like I said, we're not trying to put a man on the moon here. Like, let's figure out, you want to open a store, you already opened a store. Here's 12 other models of things that you could consider. Right. And the thing about entrepreneurship that we make plain to our builders is we can all care about the same problem and have different hypotheses about the way we can solve it. And that's a beautiful mental model for getting away from opinion and getting into theory. We can all be on team solve lack of fresh produce, and we can all have different do that. And all those ideas can be tried, and many of those ideas can work all side by side. We don't have to be competing against one another. And it's a really great mental frame. We also don't need to wait for, big food and big grocery and big government to do that. And that was the shocking thing from my research, was how few people it was clicking for, right? So it's not just that we need ecosystems. We really need to address the underlying agency and capacity and confidence to go, oh, I can actually open a grocery store. Like, I don't need someone's permission to do that. And I have the tools and the people around me to help me do it. Because the other sort of challenge with entrepreneurship is you learn it by doing, and usually you make a mess of it the first 2 or 3 times you try it. I know I did. And, again, let's surround you with a really smart network of people that have already done it so that maybe you get it right the first time rather than the fourth time you try it. So there's just so much when you do that reframe and you think about our country and you think about what we're fighting about around politics, a lot of what we're fighting about, we could actually start solving. We could actually be positing these ideas and like, let's just go try these things. And we're not saying not to engage in politics and not to engage in policy and government, but let's also, go build some things. So,
Yeah,
but
I think we've seen that.
I was going to ask you to jump in. Yeah.
I have so many things to say. I think was just going to mention, building off of what you were just talking about in terms of seeing problems and jumping in. We certainly saw that during the pandemic, right? At a time when people thought that entrepreneurship could be crushed, it wasn't. In fact, applications for new businesses spiked 4 months after the start of the pandemic in the US. And we've seen those high rates of business applications continue through 2023. And they were primarily around solving some of those problems, right? Around delivery and logistics and warehousing, the supply chain problems that companies were having that were impacting everyone's ability to get, produce and goods and products that they needed for their everyday lives. And so that's just such a classic case of how, every new small business, every entrepreneur is really designed to solve a problem. And we at the chamber, I know a lot of folks see the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as, a big business, trade organization, but 90% of their members are small businesses. And we, through my colleagues on the chamber side, like Tom Sullivan, who leads our small business policy, or through Co, which is a digital platform that has about 6 million visitors every year of entrepreneurs accessing resources on how to launch and run and grow a company. We really, we know that small businesses and entrepreneurs are such a critical component of our country, of our economic productivity, of, creating jobs. And we've launched a number of programs through the foundation as well during the pandemic to not just provide funding, which entrepreneurs needed, but also, to your point, to help them connect to a network and to find mentors and to build and connect with others across the country that can help share best practices and lessons learned and how to do things. One was the Coalition to Back Black Businesses, and that was a multi-year initiative support small businesses both financially and through a network of mentorship that we launched in partnership with American Express and through a number of other funders to provide over $14 million in grants for that mentoring, coaching, resources, and other opportunities. And we've just launched a new initiative we piloted in 2023, and my colleagues are bringing it across the nation this year, called Biz Connect, which is sort of to the point that you were just making, which is really focused on the financial assistance, but also, which we hear from entrepreneurs all the time, is their number one barrier. Also about building that network and connecting them to other communities. And so we are really excited about the opportunities to help entrepreneurs across the country and to leverage the power of business and our broader network to help entrepreneurs that have these great ideas and are trying to bring them to market and just need some extra help to get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really good way to turn our focus to, we've sort of talked about Americana and apple pie, and we can go build things and let's go do that. But it's really only truly democratic if everyone is participating, if there's equal opportunity to be engaged, right, and true accessibility. So I'm seeing a lot of our Q&A, getting into like how do we get more people involved? How do we build strong ecosystems? And so let's start with, some of the barriers and the challenges that if it clicks for them that I'm the one, I've got the idea for the grocery store, I've got the idea for, fill in the blank. what are the barriers that are there today that keep that from being realized?
I'll dive in. So I think uh, the way we've been tackling a lot of these entrepreneurial questions from a policy standpoint or a governance standpoint has been through like very kind of targeted programmatic interventions. Like we're going to build this government small business center, or we're going to build this loan guarantee program, and those are all important and they're very useful. What we haven't done is to look at it holistically, to say, how about all the 360 holistic issues that all the entrepreneurs face, from the red tape to the sort of the unlevel taxation to healthcare subsidized for large companies instead of smaller businesses, to workforce issues where government subsidizes workforce training for large corporations, but not for entrepreneurial businesses, to government contracting, where it tends to favor large incumbents. There's been about an 80% decline in new entrants into the federal government contracting system over the last 2 decades. So there's been a huge drop off in the ability to break into government contracting, to the educational system. I've traveled the country, and one of these things I hear is, well, you can go through 13 years of public school education, and the day you get your diploma, you have no idea how to be self-sufficient, right? You might have skills to apply to college, or you might be able to apply for an entry-level job, but you don't have the capacity to even manage your own money. You don't have the capacity to learn how to build a product. You don't know how to actually build a profession. And so we've actually created a system that tends to be more about how do you train people into narrow pathways as opposed to how do you build self-sufficiency and resilience. And so really the system as a whole we need to rethink of this as a democratic uprising around entrepreneurship, that all these different aspects of governance have kind of gotten away from the ability of giving people the power, and that we need to actually think about how do we actually shift all these different things away. And so all these things from, if you look at the sum of all these parts, the World Bank used to do its doing business study, and they found that the US on average charges about $800 in fees to be able to start a business. And I've actually run into people, even in government, who'll say, well, if someone can't find $800 to start a business, they shouldn't be starting it. And that to me shows just sort of there's an elitism there and a real sense of privilege, because when half the country is living paycheck to paycheck, $800 is actually a significant sum of money for people. It also is a competitiveness issue for the country, because a lot of other countries have fewer fees, from China to Brazil to Canada, Sweden to Switzerland. Countries that we think of as more bureaucratic and less entrepreneurial actually have fewer costs to be able to get started. And so the objective data shows that we are making it hard on people. And that's just the fees alone, not to mention the issues of fear and access and the lack of information that's out there.
And I'd layer in the ubiquitous friends and family that, we supposedly all have, that are supposed to help us, get those, or, using your credit cards or your savings. Many Americans don't have access to credit. They don't have a savings account. I know I didn't have rich friends and family to go to. I had no credit, no savings when I tried to launch my first business. And we hear, is part of the reason why, in addition to our programming, we give Pebble funds, or we actually, in our name, give our builders a credit card with up to $5,000 on it to cover the cost of that early experimentation that they run, to not only learn how to do entrepreneurship, but to actually put their idea into action in the real world. And we hear time and time again, sort of people will say, oh, well, $5,000, does that really make a difference? But we hear testimonial after testimonial after testimonial, how that little, to us, that little bit of money was game changing for people. And so I want to start digging into the questions, and there's a couple that are just sort of related to some of the things that we've been talking about. And so I'll start with Colin's question around, how do we make being and acting entrepreneurial a normal skill across more disciplines, right? Not just entrepreneurs doing entrepreneur things, but scientists and others in the world. Like, it's not a core thing that we're teaching, I don't think, in most schools, and it's part of the reason that we just found ourselves going, if it only was a different word other than entrepreneur, because the minute you say entrepreneur, people go, I don't want to start a business. You're like, yeah, but I actually mean like more than that. So that's why we use builder. So I'm curious your all's thoughts on how do we do this? What are our recommendations?
I'm happy to jump in. So we actually think a lot about the connections between civic skills and, leadership or workplace skills, as we like to call them, as we think about employers of all kinds, right? So some of the things I mentioned earlier around, problem solving, critical thinking, working together with people who might have different ideas about how to solve a problem, but you're working toward a shared mission or objective. And we need to start really teaching those civic skills and those, because they enable us to be better leaders. They enable us to be better members of our communities, because the more knowledge that we have about how we can engage and leverage the systems around us, the more engaged we become. And studies show that the more knowledge, civics knowledge and engagement that you have, how that can impact polarization and really lead to a decrease of polarization, which then leads to being able to work together, to have civil discussion, and to work with people toward, tackling these big problems. And so, through things like the National Civics Bee, through things like the work that we're doing through Civics at Work, to really use employers as networks to share information about civics and civic skills, and how to engage at the local, state, and national level is just the beginning. But I think it really starts with knowledge and about incorporating those skills from a young age, and not waiting until, they're graduating high school or looking to what their career might be, to think about what their role and responsibility is within their community, and really starting to have those conversations at the elementary school, middle school age, when, kids are, more open and more optimistic, and are, see the world through a different lens.
Yeah, totally agree. I want to make sure that we get two more questions in, and I recognize that we've got just a few more minutes. So I want to save one for you, Victor, around lots of questions around policy, local policy versus federal policy. At what level should we be engaging? And that really ties also into the sort of regional entrepreneurial ecosystems question, right? Like policy and ecosystem building, what needs to be done and at what level to make sure that it isn't just people who live in Silicon Valley or Austin or New York that get to engage. But before we get there, I want to go to the question from Kathleen, which, sort of a bit the elephant in the room. So, to what extent does it matter what we build versus the fact that we build, right? So we hear a lot of hand wringing around like the unintended consequences of social media and the, downsides of some of the things that have been built. Like we think a lot about what we call disrupt to democratize versus just disrupting. We're very interested in things that lead to widespread thriving, as opposed to things that are sort of more leaning towards being merely extractive. So I would love your thoughts on, does it matter what we build, or does it just matter that we get people building?
Mm. Well, it certainly matters what we build in the long run, because the last thing we need is more addictive tools that take our time and attention away from productive things. But I think the challenge, of course, is that it's hard to know in advance, right? And everything has two sides to it. So you might argue on one hand that social media tools are very addictive. On the other hand, they've connected the world and kept communities together and friends connected in ways. And it's hard to say, how do you predict all that stuff in advance? I've done work in developing countries where the challenge, of course, is that you stifle the entrepreneurship. And I've seen cases where entrepreneurs are working on things, and they'll do it because it's a national priority to do it, and the nation will fund it. But then they can't explain why they're doing it outside of the fact that it's been set as a national priority, and they can't find customers that'll actually pay for this kind of thing. And so that's actually a problem. Like people, if you start setting priorities in entrepreneurship from the top down, you can't really capture all the different possibilities that are out there. And so I think we definitely should be supporting the good things in life, but at the same time, we can't over control it. And you end up stifling through unintended consequences a lot of entrepreneurship when you try to tell people in advance what's good and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hilary, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would definitely say that it matters what we build, and that we should really pour our focus into, innovations that help explore where there are gaps, where there are needs, where there are, emerging issues and challenges, to be able to test new ideas and novel approaches, and to, things that contribute to social good and social impact. And there certainly are pros and cons of everything. Greater access to technology and social media and things like that have enabled a lot of entrepreneurs with great business ideas to launch and to scale and to build their network in a much faster and broader way than ever before. So it's really about, I think, weighing what those potential unintended consequences might be. But I think if you're setting out with the mission to tackle a problem and to come up with a better solution, you're going to end up in a place where you're building something that's productive and that's enhancing society and enhancing the business community as a whole.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to the policy and ecosystems. Lots of questions around, what's working? What are some of the surprises or best practices? Is policy federal only or state and local? What could we be doing to support regional ecosystems? So I'm going to give you that smorgasbord of questions and ask each of you to sort of pick at that and address based on your organization's focus, the aspect that is most relevant.
The smorgasbord. So is it local or state or federal? The answer is yes. It's all of it. It's all together. And how do we support regional ecosystems? Here's how it's interlinked. I'll give you an example. So workforce training, for instance. So the way with the workforce training, infrastructure was put in place, as we were deindustrializing about half a century ago. And so the federal government spends around $13+ billion a year on federal workforce support. That goes to the states in terms of block grants for the states, which run workforce development boards. The states, in turn, give it out to local cities, communities, counties in local workforce development boards to allocate out. And they set the agenda on how workforce funds are spent. So in the state of Missouri, for instance, it's like $100 million of workforce money that goes out, and the region around greater Kansas City gets around 13 million or so a year in workforce training. Almost zero of that goes towards entrepreneurship. That is, people that want to get a job with someone else. That's what that money is for. If you're trying to create your own job or create more jobs, the money doesn't support it because the system isn't designed around it, doesn't track it, it doesn't consider it successful. In fact, if you create your own job and build a company that employs 100, that's considered a failure of modern workforce because you didn't get placed in a corporate job somewhere. So that's a federal, state, and local. You can actually see the cascade of money flowing down. And so all of it's interlinked in terms of how we think of it. And there's a breakdown in terms of thinking of, well, what is workforce today? If workforce half a century ago was getting placed in a corporate job, workforce today should also include the ability to create your own job. And so what we have to do is to rethink that. And that is happening now within the field of economic development. So just in the last few years alone, we've seen a transformation of how economic development is being done now. So 10 years ago, if you asked people in economic development, what's your priority? It was large company expansion, relocation, recruitment, attraction, subsidization, incentives. Now, basically, one of the top 2 or 3 issues is entrepreneurship. And how do we support homegrown entrepreneurial activity? That is a huge shift because that's a $50 billion plus a year economic development industry now that's been geared towards large company, moving them across borders and giving them subsidies. And now the people in the work are saying we've run out of room to run on that. There's no more growth left. Everyone's competing for the same 200 companies every year, trying to build their warehouses and distribution centers.
Amazon HQ2 did us all in.
Yeah, Amazon HQ2, there's a couple hundred of those a year of different scales. People want to build their homegrown things, and now economic development shifted there. And that's how you have to do it. You have to actually shift all the local practices around this as a legitimate area of concern.
I will say from my experience at Startup America, and I'm curious, Hilary, your thoughts, and then we'll need to wind down, unfortunately, because we could go on forever, is that there's a lot more room for innovation and creativity and experimentation at the local level, and far more than I think people realize. And so when we tend to think about entrepreneurship policy, we immediately go on marches to the White House and Capitol Hill, when in fact, potentially much more could be being done locally in City Hall and in the halls of the local economic development agency. Hilary, I'll let you weigh in, and then I'll make a couple closing remarks, and we'll let everybody hop off.
Great. Yes, I definitely agree. From our perspective, everything is local. And I think, Victor spoke so much on the policy end that I will speak to on the sort of civic engagement end as well. You can't underestimate or underscore just how impactful and big seismic change can happen when it starts at a grassroots local level, when you start at the community level, because that's where there's trust, especially today. People trust their local businesses, they trust their local entrepreneurs, their local systems and institutions. And if you can understand how to engage and who to engage and how to connect and how to, impact change at the local level, that's where it all has to start, because it builds from there, expands from there. That's where, how coalitions can be built and how, campaigns can broaden. But it really takes the sort of the jumping in and the sort of formation of trust and parties and organizations at the local level to get to anything that can scale even to, the state and national level. And so small acts at the local level can have big impact, not so much at the national level. And so definitely agree that, everything is local and should really focus on how to engage within communities as a starting point.
Wonderful. Well, I know we have enough questions that we could go on for at least another hour, and I have like 2 more pages of questions of my own, but we are going to take a copy of all the questions from the Q&A panel. We'll get them answered and we're going to post them in a write-up. So for those of you that joined us, we're going to share a summary of today's conversation. We'll share the links and the sources to all the research and the data points that were mentioned on the call. I know a couple of you mentioned questions on that in the Q&A, and then we'll make sure to address the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. I want to thank our panelists for joining us and for really being willing to engage in this conversation in a moment where sometimes politics and democracy are a bit of a hot potato. But I think, as you can see from all of our viewpoints, yes, vote, yes, be engaged in civics, but we have a lot more power than we think we do to take action. And that action is primarily individual, at a local level. See something, solve something, figure out what you care about, what problems you want to tackle, what ideas are rattling around in your mind, and learn how to build. Let's actually become, again, a nation of builders. I do invite you to join the rest of the webinars that we'll be having throughout the year. We'll be addressing some of the topics we talked about today, from the obstacles on the on-ramp to entrepreneurship as workforce development. In fact, thank you for hat tip on that topic and more. So thank you for joining us for this conversation today. We hope everybody has a great afternoon, and let's go build things.
Thank you, Donna. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everybody.